Imagine digging up a corpse, dressing it in papal robes, propping it on a throne, and putting it on trial for crimes it allegedly committed while alive. Sounds like a horror movie, right? But this actually happened in the heart of the Catholic Church in the year 897 AD, in an event so bizarre, so grotesque, so unbelievably real that history remembers it as the Cadaver Synod. Picture this: the rotting body of Pope Formosus, dead for 9 months, dragged from his grave, dressed in full pontifical vestments, and seated before a tribunal of living bishops and clergy. A deacon stood beside the corpse, speaking on its behalf, while Pope Stephen VI screamed accusations at the decomposing remains. The charges: perjury, coveting the papacy, and violating church law. The verdict: guilty. The punishment: the corpse's blessing fingers were hacked off, the body was stripped of its robes, dragged through the streets of Rome, and hurled into the Tiber River like garbage. This wasn't fiction. This wasn't myth. This was the Catholic Church at its most unhinged. A moment when politics, revenge, and religion collided in the most macabre spectacle the medieval world had ever seen. Welcome to the story of the Cadaver Synod. The trial that put a dead pope on trial, shook the foundations of the papacy, and revealed just how far powerful men will go to rewrite history, even if it means digging up the dead. Rome, January 897 AD. The great Basilica of St. John Lateran, the Pope's own cathedral, the mother church of Christendom, is filled with bishops, priests, and clergy from across the papal states. They've been summoned for a church council, a synod to address matters of grave importance to the Catholic Church. But this is no ordinary synod. At the center of the basilica, seated on a throne in full papal regalia, triple crown, elaborate vestments, the ring of the fisherman, is a pope. His hands rest on the throne's arms. His head is tilted slightly, as if in contemplation. He sits in judgment, awaiting the proceedings to begin. There's just one problem. He's been dead for 7 months. His body, exhumed from its grave, has been dressed in papal robes and propped up on the throne. Decomposition has set in. The smell must be overwhelming. His skin has darkened and withered. His jaw hangs slack. Empty eye sockets stare at nothing. This corpse, this rotting remnant of what was once Pope Formosus, is about to be put on trial for crimes allegedly committed during his pontificate. A living pope, Stephen VI, will serve as prosecutor and judge. Questions will be shouted at the corpse. A deacon, hiding behind the throne, will speak for the dead man, providing answers in a trembling voice. Charges will be read. Evidence will be presented. And at the end of this grotesque spectacle, the corpse will be found guilty. This is the Cadaver Synod, the Synodus Horrenda, the horrific synod, one of the strangest, most disturbing, and most politically revealing events in the history of the Catholic Church. It's a story that sounds like Gothic fiction, like something from a horror novel set in the Dark Ages. But it really happened. And to understand why it happened, why a pope would dig up his predecessor's corpse and put it on trial, we need to understand the world of 9th-century Rome, a world of political chaos, competing noble families, and popes who were as much secular rulers fighting for survival as they were spiritual leaders of Christendom. Welcome to boring history, though I promise you, there's nothing boring about what you're about to witness. This is the story of how the papacy descended into its darkest hour. This is the story of power, revenge, and the desecration of the dead. This is the story of the Cadaver Synod. To understand the Cadaver Synod, we first need to understand the world that produced it. And that means understanding Rome in the late 9th century, a city and an institution in crisis. The year is 897 AD. The Roman Empire fell in the West over 400 years ago, in 476 AD. The grandeur of ancient Rome is long gone. The massive aqueducts that once brought fresh water to 1 million people are mostly broken and abandoned. The great public baths are ruins. The Colosseum, where gladiators once fought, is now a quarry where people scavenge stone for other buildings. The Forum, heart of the ancient empire, is partially buried and used to graze cattle, so much so that it's called the Campo Vaccino, the cow field. The population has collapsed. Ancient Rome at its height had perhaps 1 million inhabitants. By 900 AD, Rome has maybe 30,000 people, a catastrophic decline of 97%. Entire districts of the city are abandoned, overgrown with vegetation, inhabited only by bandits and wild animals. The great city has become a shadow of itself, a decaying monument to lost glory. What remains is centered around the Tiber River, and particularly around the Vatican Hill and the Lateran Palace. These are the centers of what power remains in Rome, the power of the papacy. Because while political Rome fell, religious Rome survived and indeed grew stronger. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, claimed spiritual authority over all of Christendom as the successor of Saint Peter, to whom Christ had given the keys to heaven. "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church," Jesus had said, according to the Gospel of Matthew. The popes claimed to be the direct successors of Peter, the rock upon which the church was built. This gave them immense spiritual authority. In theory, popes were the ultimate religious authority in the Christian world. Kings and emperors might rule kingdoms, but the pope ruled souls. He could crown emperors or refuse to crown them. He could excommunicate kings, releasing their subjects from oaths of loyalty. He held, in principle, the keys to heaven and hell. But in practice, in late ninth century Rome, this spiritual authority translated into a very messy and dangerous form of secular power. The papacy controlled territory, the papal states, a band of territory across central Italy. This made the Pope not just a religious figure, but a secular ruler, a temporal lord with armies, revenues, and all the political entanglements that came with earthly power. And in the fractured political landscape of ninth century Italy, being a secular ruler was a very dangerous business. Let me paint you a picture of Italy in this period. The Italian peninsula is not united. There is no Italy as a nation. That won't exist for another 1,000 years. Instead, there's a chaotic patchwork of competing powers, all fighting for control, all making and breaking alliances based on momentary advantage. In the north, the Carolingian Empire, the empire created by Charlemagne and his descendants, technically holds power. Charlemagne had been crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day, 800 AD, creating a new Roman Empire in the West that was supposed to restore order and protect the Church. But by the late 800s, Charlemagne's empire is falling apart. His grandsons divided the empire and fought each other. Weak rulers followed strong ones. The empire is fragmenting. In Italy specifically, there are multiple claimants to power. There's the nominal king of Italy, often backed by the German Carolingian rulers. There are powerful dukes controlling different regions, the Duke of Spoleto to the east of Rome, various Lombard princes in the south. There are Byzantine Greeks still holding territory in southern Italy and Sicily, representing what remains of the Eastern Roman Empire. And increasingly, there are Muslim raiders from North Africa, called Saracens, attacking coastal areas and even threatening Rome itself. The papacy sits in the middle of this chaos, trying to survive and maintain its independence. Popes need to ally with secular powers for military protection. Rome has been sacked multiple times in this period and will be sacked again. But they also need to avoid being dominated by any single secular power, because losing independence means losing authority. So popes play a dangerous political game, allying with various Italian nobles and foreign powers, crowning some rulers as emperor and rejecting others, making promises and breaking them, always trying to stay one step ahead of the powerful forces that could crush them. And all of this political maneuvering is further complicated by the fact that the papacy itself is controlled by Roman noble families who see the papal office not primarily as a spiritual position, but as a source of power and wealth to be captured and controlled. There are several powerful families in Rome, the Theophylacti being the most dominant in this period. These families control networks of clients and supporters. They have armed retainers. They control appointments to church positions in and around Rome. And they fight each other for dominance, with the ultimate prize being control of the papacy itself. When one family's candidate becomes pope, he can distribute church offices to the family's supporters, control the church's considerable revenues, make alliances that benefit the family, and wield the unique power that comes with being pope. the ability to crown emperors, excommunicate enemies, and claim divine authority for political actions. So the papal throne is worth fighting for, and families do fight for it, sometimes literally. Popes are elected, but elections can be manipulated. Supporters of one candidate might physically prevent opponents from voting. Armed retainers might intimidate electors. Rival candidates might both claim election and need to fight it out for control of the Lateran Palace and St. Peter's Basilica. Once elected, popes are not safe. They can be overthrown by rival families. They can be imprisoned. They can be murdered. The turnover is remarkable. Between 872 and 1012, there are 45 popes, meaning the average pontificate lasts about 3 years. Some die natural deaths, but many are deposed, murdered, or mutilated. Yes, mutilated. Because in this period, physical mutilation disqualifies someone from holding church office. Cut out a rival's tongue or gouge out his eyes or cut off his nose, and he can no longer serve as pope or bishop. It's brutal but effective. This is the world of the saeculum obscurum, the Dark Age, or more poetically, the pornocracy, a period from roughly 880 to 1050, when the papacy is dominated by local Roman noble families, when popes are made and unmade with alarming frequency, when spiritual authority is thoroughly intertwined with, and often subordinated to secular power politics. It's in this context that our story unfolds, because the Cadaver Synod isn't an inexplicable outburst of medieval madness. It's the logical, if extreme, outcome of the political situation in which the papacy found itself. It's what happens when the spiritual leader of Western Christendom is also a secular Italian prince fighting for survival in a world of ruthless power politics. The trial of the corpse is really a political purge disguised as a religious proceeding. It's an attempt to delegitimize a previous pope's acts, to justify a change in papal policy, and to consolidate the power of the noble family currently in control by destroying the legacy of their rival's pope. To understand it fully, we need to understand the two main characters in this drama: the corpse on trial, Pope Formosus, and his accuser, Pope Stephen VI. We need to understand who they were, what families backed them, what political positions they represented, and why Stephen felt compelled to dig up his predecessor and stage this macabre tribunal. Let's start with the corpse. Let's talk about Formosus, Pope Formosus. The name means handsome or beautiful in Latin, Formosus, the beautiful one. We don't know if he lived up to his name physically, but we know he was intelligent, ambitious, and skilled at navigating the treacherous waters of 9th-century church politics. At least he was skilled until the very end. Formosus was born around 816 AD, probably in Rome or nearby. He entered church service young and rose through the ranks with apparent competence and support from the right people. His rise tells us he was well-connected, politically savvy, and talented enough to be noticed by the popes who appointed him to increasingly important positions. In 864, Pope Nicholas I made Formosus the cardinal bishop of Porto, one of the suburbicarian sees, the dioceses surrounding Rome. These were prestigious positions, and the bishops who held them formed an inner circle of advisors to the pope. This appointment marked Formosus as a man of importance in the church hierarchy. But Formosus wasn't content to stay in Rome and serve as an advisor. He had ambitions for a wider stage. And Nicholas, I had use for an ambitious and capable bishop. In 866, Nicholas sent Formosus on a crucial mission to Bulgaria. This was high-stakes church politics on an international level. Bulgaria, under Khan Boris I, had recently converted to Christianity, but Boris was playing the papacy in Rome against the Byzantine Patriarchate in Constantinople, trying to get the best deal for Bulgaria, specifically, trying to get an independent Bulgarian church with its own patriarch, rather than being subordinate to either Rome or Constantinople. Pope Nicholas sent Formosus as his legate to Bulgaria with a mission: secure Bulgaria for the Roman Church, not the Greek Church. Prevent the Byzantines from expanding their religious authority into Bulgarian territory. And if possible, get Boris to accept Roman authority over the Bulgarian Church. Formosus succeeded brilliantly. He impressed Boris. He strengthened ties between Bulgaria and Rome. He preached, performed baptisms, consecrated Bulgarian priests, and generally established a strong Roman presence. His mission was considered a success, and he returned to Rome as a rising star, a man who had represented the papacy successfully on a difficult international mission. But success breeds jealousy and fear. Formosus was too successful, too ambitious, too capable. He was building his own power base, and in the paranoid world of 9th century Roman politics, this made him dangerous. In 872, Pope Nicholas died. His successor, Hadrian II, died in 872 after just 5 years. The next pope, John VIII, who reigned from 872 to 882, was a very different kind of man from Nicholas, more paranoid, more politically insecure, more afraid of rivals. And Formosus looked like a rival. He had his own supporters. He had international connections, particularly in Bulgaria. He had demonstrated capability and ambition. John VIII saw him as a threat. In 876, John VIII accused Formosus of various crimes. The charges were, first, conspiring to become pope himself. John claimed Formosus was building a faction to support his own elevation to the papal throne, undermining the current pope's authority. Second, abandoning his see. The claim was that Formosus had left his diocese of Porto without permission, violating his duties as bishop. In church law, a bishop was married to his diocese and wasn't supposed to abandon it any more than a man should abandon his wife. Third, despoiling Rome. This probably means either taking church property for his own use or supporting rival factions that were literally plundering Rome in the chaotic political conflicts of the time. Fourth, aspiring to the Bulgarian archbishopric. The accusation was that Formosus wanted to leave Rome entirely and become the archbishop, essentially independent church leader, of Bulgaria, which would be a betrayal of his loyalty to Rome. How much of this was true? It's impossible to know for certain. The charges were politically motivated, designed to remove a threat, but they probably had some basis in reality. Formosus likely did aspire to higher office. Most ambitious churchmen did. He probably did have supporters who thought he'd make a good pope. He may well have been in contact with Bulgarian officials about a prominent role in their church. Whether these activities constituted crimes or were just normal church politics probably depended on your perspective and your factional loyalties. But John VIII had the power to make accusations stick. At a synod in 876, Formosus was deposed from his position as Cardinal Bishop of Porto. He was excommunicated, cut off from the church, his soul consigned to damnation, and he was forced to flee Rome to save his life. If he'd stayed, he might have been imprisoned, mutilated, or killed. Formosus went into exile, probably to one of the many territories outside Rome where different political factions held power. And there he stayed, an excommunicated exile, his career apparently destroyed for several years. But church politics change quickly. Allies become enemies. Enemies become allies. The faction in power today might be out of power tomorrow. And Formosus had friends and allies who didn't forget him. In 878, things began to shift. There was pressure on Pope John VIII to lift Formosus's excommunication. Various political factors aligned. Perhaps John needed the support of Formosus's allies. Perhaps the political threat Formosus posed had diminished. Perhaps it was simply that enough time had passed. John VIII agreed to lift the excommunication, but on conditions. Formosus had to swear an oath that he would never return to Rome. He could be reconciled to the church, his soul no longer damned, but he had to stay away from the center of power. He could not return to his position as cardinal bishop. He was to live out his days in exile, harmless. Formosus apparently agreed. The excommunication was lifted. He was once again a member of the church in good standing, though stripped of his position and exiled from Rome. And there he might have stayed, a footnote in history, an example of an ambitious churchman who reached too high and was slapped down. But then John VIII died in 882, allegedly poisoned, and then clubbed to death when the poison worked too slowly. a dramatic end that tells you everything about the violence of papal politics in this period. And over the next few years, popes came and went. Marinus I reigned for less than 2 years. Hadrian III for less than 2 years. Stephen V for about 3 years. Each pope represented different factional interests. Each had different allies and different enemies. And at some point, the exact date isn't recorded, Formosus returned to Rome. Perhaps the oath not to return was forgotten or considered void after John VII's death. Perhaps Formosus's allies were strong enough to protect him. Perhaps new popes needed his support or his administrative abilities. Whatever the reason, he returned. And he waited. He was now in his 70s, an old man by medieval standards, a survivor of the brutal church politics that had destroyed so many others. He had been to the heights of power, had fallen into disgrace and exile, and had survived to return. And in 891, when Pope Stephen V died, Formosus saw his chance. Or rather, his supporters saw their chance. The factional balance in Rome had shifted. Formosus's allies were in a position to make a bid for the papacy, and they had a candidate who was experienced, capable, and well known, Formosus himself. The election was contentious, as papal elections in this period usually were. There was opposition from those who remembered Formosus's previous disgrace, who considered him a schemer and an oath-breaker. But the supporters were strong enough. Perhaps bribes were paid. Perhaps promises were made. Perhaps threats were issued. However it was accomplished, Formosus was elected pope on October 6, 891. The exiled bishop, the deposed cardinal, the excommunicated schemer, was now the supreme pontiff, the vicar of Christ, the successor of Saint Peter. He took the name Formosus, keeping his birth name rather than taking a new papal name as was sometimes done. He was pope. He had reached the pinnacle. He was 75 years old, and he would reign for just over 5 years. 5 years that would set in motion the events that would lead to his corpse being exhumed and tried. Because everything Formosus did as pope would be controversial. Every alliance he made would create enemies. Every decision would be questioned. And after his death, those who opposed him would seek not just to reverse his policies, but to destroy his legacy so completely that his very corpse would be made to answer for his crimes. What did Formosus do as pope that created such lasting hatred? To understand that, we need to understand the central political question of his pontificate: who should be crowned Holy Roman Emperor. In the late 9th century, the most important political question in Italy was, who controls imperial power? Who gets to wear the crown of the Holy Roman Emperor? And crucially, who does the Pope support in this contest? This wasn't just a theoretical question of who had the fanciest title. The Holy Roman Emperor commanded armies. He had legal authority over much of Italy and Germany. He could protect the papacy from its enemies, or threaten it if the Pope displeased him. He controlled vast resources and networks of loyal nobles. Having the right man as emperor could mean security and prosperity for Rome and the papacy. Having the wrong man could mean disaster. And the Pope held a crucial power. Only the Pope could crown someone emperor. You might win battles, control territory, and claim the title, but without papal coronation, you weren't legitimate. The Pope's coronation transformed a mere king or duke into an emperor blessed by God, standing in the tradition of Constantine and Charlemagne. This gave popes leverage. They could demand concessions before agreeing to crown someone. They could threaten to crown a rival if an emperor displeased them. But it also made them targets. Aspiring emperors might try to force a pope to crown them. Reigning emperors might try to control the papacy to ensure their heirs would be crowned. And disappointed candidates might seek revenge against a pope who crowned their rival. When Formosus became pope in 891, the imperial situation was chaotic. The Carolingian Empire that Charlemagne had built was fragmented. Various relatives and descendants of Charlemagne controlled different territories and had various claims to the imperial title, but none was dominant. In Italy specifically, the key player was Guy III, Duke of Spoleto. Spoleto was a duchy east of Rome, and Guy was a powerful Italian noble with ambitions. He wanted to be king of Italy, and beyond that, Holy Roman Emperor. and he had leverage over Rome. His armies were close. He could threaten the city. He could protect it from other threats. He had the power to help or hurt the papacy. In 891, just before Formosus became pope, Guy had managed to get himself crowned emperor by Pope Stephen V, Formosus's predecessor. This was a major achievement for Guy. He'd reached the pinnacle of secular power. When Formosus became pope a few months later, he inherited this situation. Guy of Spoleto was already emperor, crowned by the previous pope. Formosus could have simply accepted this and worked with Guy. But Formosus didn't want Guy as emperor. Why not? Several reasons, all intertwined with the complex politics of the period. First, factional opposition. Guy represented certain Roman noble families and certain political interests. Formosus had risen to the papacy with the support of different families with different interests. Supporting Guy would mean empowering Formosus's enemies. Second, Italian versus foreign power. Guy was Italian, which meant he was close, powerful, and dangerous. Italian rulers could dominate the papacy too easily. They could march on Rome with a few days' notice and impose their will. Formosus, like many popes before him, preferred a foreign protector who was powerful enough to help when needed but too distant to interfere in day-to-day papal affairs. Third, Guy's character and ambitions. Guy was aggressive, ambitious, and had shown willingness to use force to get what he wanted. Formosus probably feared that having Guy as emperor would mean papal subservience. Guy might try to control who became pope after Formosus, or interfere in church appointments, or demand that Rome support his military adventures. Fourth, personal history. Formosus and Guy apparently had bad blood between them, though the sources don't give us details. Perhaps Guy had been among those who opposed Formosus's election. Perhaps they'd clashed in previous political maneuverings. Medieval politics was often very personal. Old grudges could drive major political decisions. For whatever combination of these reasons, Formosus decided that Guy had to go. He would not accept Guy's imperial title. He would work to replace him with someone else. This was dangerous. Guy was powerful and violent. Challenging him risked retaliation. But Formosus had an alternative candidate in mind, someone who could potentially defeat Guy or at least balance his power. Formosus looked north beyond the Alps to the eastern Frankish kingdom, essentially Germany. There, a king named Arnulf of Carinthia ruled. Arnulf was a great-grandson of Louis the German, who was himself a grandson of Charlemagne. So Arnulf had Carolingian blood. He was part of the imperial dynasty. More importantly, Arnulf was powerful. He'd defeated Viking raiders. He'd consolidated control over the eastern Frankish territories. He commanded armies. And he was far enough away that he couldn't easily dominate Rome on a daily basis, but close enough to intervene when needed. In 893, Formosus sent envoys to Arnulf with a message: "Come to Italy. Help free the papacy from Guy of Spoleto's oppressive dominance, and in return I will crown you Holy Roman Emperor." This was an extraordinary move. Formosus was essentially declaring that Guy's coronation, performed by the previous pope, was invalid or at least unacceptable. He was inviting a foreign invasion of Italy to overthrow the current emperor. He was risking Guy's immediate retaliation. Arnulf saw an opportunity. The imperial title was prestigious and came with authority over Italy, but he couldn't immediately march south. He had problems in his own territories to deal with first. So he promised Formosus he'd come, but not right away. Meanwhile, Formosus had to deal with Guy's wrath. Guy was furious at this betrayal. The Pope had essentially declared him illegitimate and was trying to replace him. Guy marched on Rome in 893, intending to teach Formosus a lesson. But Guy didn't capture Rome. Either he couldn't take the fortifications, or he calculated that martyring the Pope would cause more problems than it solved. Instead, he besieged the city for a time, then withdrew after extracting some kind of concession or promise from Formosus. The details are murky, but Formosus survived. Then, in 894, Guy died. Some sources say it was illness, some hint at poison. Either way, the situation changed dramatically. Guy's son, Lambert, inherited his father's titles and claims. Lambert was crowned co-emperor by his father before Guy's death and now claimed to be sole emperor. But Lambert was young and less formidable than his father. Formosus saw an opening. He renewed his appeals to Arnulf. "Come now, the timing is perfect. The young Lambert can be pushed aside. Italy awaits its liberator." Arnulf finally moved. In 894, he crossed the Alps with an army. He marched into northern Italy, defeating Lambert's forces in several engagements. By 896, he had reached Rome. Formosus kept his promise. In February 896, he crowned Arnulf as Holy Roman Emperor in St. Peter's Basilica. It was a moment of triumph for both men. Arnulf had achieved the imperial dignity. Formosus had successfully replaced an unacceptable emperor with one of his own choosing. But the triumph was short-lived. Shortly after the coronation, Arnulf fell ill. The nature of his illness isn't clear from the sources, possibly a stroke or seizure disorder. Whatever it was, it incapacitated him. He couldn't continue his campaign in Italy. His armies began withdrawing north, carrying their stricken emperor with them. Arnulf would never return to Italy. He'd reign as emperor in name, but increasingly disabled, until his death in 899. His incapacity meant he couldn't fulfill the role Formosus had envisioned for him. He couldn't suppress Lambert, couldn't impose order on Italy, couldn't provide the strong protection the papacy needed. Formosus had gambled everything on Arnulf, and now Arnulf was gone, incapacitated, useless. Lambert was still alive, still claiming to be emperor, and now thoroughly enraged at Formosus for trying to replace him. Various Italian nobles who'd supported Guy and Lambert were equally furious. Formosus had made powerful enemies, and his champion had failed. The Pope was now in terrible danger. Lambert's supporters in Rome, the noble families aligned with Spoleto, were probably plotting revenge. Formosus must have known his days were numbered. He'd reached his highest point and could now only fear the fall. On April 4, 896, just 2 months after crowning Arnulf, Pope Formosus died. He was about 80 years old. The official cause of death was recorded as natural. He was an old man who'd lived a long and stressful life. His heart simply gave out, but many suspected he was poisoned. In an age when poison was a common political tool, when popes were murdered regularly, the timing was suspicious. Formosus died just when he'd become most inconvenient to his enemies. His death removed a major obstacle for Lambert's supporters. We'll never know for certain if Formosus died naturally or was murdered, but either way, his death should have ended the matter. In normal times, a pope dies, he's buried with appropriate ceremony, his successor is elected, and life continues. Previous conflicts are usually forgotten or at least set aside. The church moves forward. But these weren't normal times, and Formosus's enemies weren't willing to let the matter rest with his death. His policies needed to be reversed. His acts as pope needed to be invalidated. His entire pontificate needed to be erased from history. And for that, his body would need to answer for his crimes. When Formosus died in April 896, the question of succession was immediately contentious. Different factions in Rome supported different candidates. The faction that had supported Formosus wanted a pope who would continue his policies, someone who would maintain Arnulf's legitimacy as emperor and oppose Lambert of Spoleto. But the pro-Lambert faction, supporters of the Spoleto dynasty, wanted someone who would reverse everything Formosus had done. Someone who would recognize Lambert as the rightful emperor. Someone who would repudiate Arnulf's coronation. Someone who, ideally, would thoroughly destroy Formosus's legacy. The immediate successor to Formosus was Boniface VI, but he reigned for only 15 days in April 896 before dying, possibly murdered, possibly of natural causes, possibly of both. 15 days is not enough time to accomplish anything politically significant. Boniface barely had time to be consecrated before he was dead. After Boniface's rapid demise, the pro-Lambert faction managed to get their candidate elected, Stephen VI, who became pope in May 896. Who was Stephen VI? Unfortunately, we know very little about his background before he became pope. We don't know when he was born, where he came from, or how he rose through church ranks. He appears in the historical record, essentially at the moment he becomes pope, and he disappears from it within about a year after being deposed and probably murdered. What we do know is that he was a creature of the Spoleto faction. He was supported by Lambert's mother, Ageltrude, who was the real power behind young Lambert's throne, a formidable woman who wielded military and political power, commanded armies, and intimidated rivals. If Lambert was the nominal ruler, Ageltrude was the one actually making decisions and enforcing them. Stephen owed his papacy to Ageltrude and the Spoleto party. He was their man, and they had clear expectations: reverse Formosus's policies and destroy his legacy. But there was a problem. How do you delegitimize a previous pope's actions? How do you declare that his coronation of Arnulf was invalid? How do you undo acts performed by someone who, at the time, was the legitimate vicar of Christ on earth? The Catholic Church has always faced a theological problem when popes do controversial things. The pope is supposed to be guided by the Holy Spirit, protected from error in matters of faith and morals, the ultimate authority on earth in spiritual matters. How do you say that a pope was wrong without undermining the entire basis of papal authority? Various theological arguments could be made. You could claim that Formosus wasn't really a legitimate pope because he'd been consecrated improperly, or because he'd broken his oath not to return to Rome, or because he'd previously been deposed as bishop and therefore couldn't later become pope. But theological arguments are abstract. They convince intellectuals and church lawyers, but they don't satisfy the visceral desire for revenge. They don't provide a spectacle. They don't humiliate your enemy thoroughly enough. Stephen VI and his backers wanted something more dramatic. They wanted to humiliate Formosus completely. They wanted to stage a show trial that would make clear to everyone, to the Roman people, to the clergy, to foreign rulers, that Formosus had been a criminal and a usurper, and that everything he did was invalid. And someone, whether it was Stephen himself or his backers, we don't know, came up with an idea so bizarre, so macabre, so unprecedented that it would echo through history. Put Formosus himself on trial. Never mind that he'd been dead for 7 months. Never mind that canon law had no provision for trying a deceased pope. Never mind that the sheer spectacle of exhuming a rotting corpse and staging a trial would strike many as sacrilegious and insane. The political benefits outweighed any scruples. If you could stage a trial where Formosus was formally accused, where evidence was presented, where he was found guilty and condemned, then you'd have clear legal justification for reversing his acts. You'd have a formal record showing his pontificate was illegitimate. You'd have a public spectacle that drove home the message: this is what happens to those who oppose Spoleto. So the plan was set in motion. Orders went out to prepare St. John Lateran's Basilica for a special synod. Bishops and clergy were summoned from across the papal states. The nature of the synod wasn't fully disclosed in advance. Many who came probably didn't know what they were about to witness. And orders went to Formosus's tomb. His grave was to be opened, his body exhumed, his corpse brought to the basilica to face judgment. Can you imagine being one of the clergy who received that order? Open the tomb of Pope Formosus and remove his body. Don't prepare it for reburial or translation to a new tomb. Prepare it for trial. The corpse was removed from its resting place. It had been buried in papal vestments, as was customary. But 7 months in the ground, even in the relative cool of a stone tomb, means significant decomposition. The body would have been partially mummified or partially decomposed, depending on conditions. The smell would have been overwhelming. The appearance would have been horrifying. The corpse was dressed in full papal regalia, the vestments it had worn in life or new vestments put on the remains, the elaborate robes that symbolized papal authority, the pallium, the wool stole that only popes and certain archbishops could wear, the ring of the fisherman, the papal tiara, and the corpse was taken to St. John Lateran into the great basilica and propped up on a throne to face judgment. The date was January 897, 9 months after Formosus's death. The synod that would become known forever after as the Synodus Horrenda, the Cadaver Synod, the Synod of the Corpse, was about to begin. Imagine the scene. St. John Lateran, the Cathedral Church of Rome, the Pope's own church. It's January 897, winter in Rome, cold but not freezing. The great basilica is filled with people, bishops in their vestments, abbots from monasteries, deacons and priests, representatives of various Roman noble families, perhaps some curious citizens who have managed to get inside to witness the spectacle. At one end of the basilica, elevated on a platform, sits Pope Stephen VI on his throne. He wears full papal vestments. This is his moment. He is the living pope, the legitimate successor of Peter, the judge who will preside over these proceedings. At the opposite end, also on a throne, sits another figure in papal vestments. But this figure is silent. This figure does not move, because this figure is a corpse. The body of Pope Formosus, dead for 9 months, exhumed from its grave, has been dressed in papal robes and propped up on a throne. A deacon stands behind the throne, hidden from view of most of the assembly, his job being to speak for the dead man when questions are asked. The smell must be overwhelming, even with incense burning in large quantities. And you can be sure they burned incense, probably as much as they could to mask the stench. The smell of decomposing human remains fills the vast stone space. People are probably holding cloth over their noses. Some are perhaps vomiting. All are disturbed by what they're witnessing. The visual spectacle is grotesque. Depending on how the body was preserved and how decomposition has progressed, Formosus's corpse might show visible rot, the skin darkened and shriveled, the face sunken where soft tissues have collapsed, the eyes gone, leaving empty sockets, the jaw possibly hanging slack or tied shut with cloth, the hands, visible because they rest on the thrown arms or hold ritual objects, are probably skeletal or mummified claws. This is the defendant. This corpse will be put on trial for crimes against the Church. Pope Stephen VI, serving as both prosecutor and judge, begins the proceedings. He addresses the corpse directly, speaking to it as if it were alive, as if it could hear and respond. Formosus, he shouts, his voice echoing in the stone basilica. You who were Bishop of Porto, why did you usurp the See of Rome? Why did you abandon your lawful bride, the Diocese of Porto, to commit adultery with the Church of Rome? This is the central charge. Canon law was clear that a bishop was married to his diocese. Moving from one diocese to another, especially seeking a higher position, was considered a form of spiritual adultery. You were abandoning your bride for another. Now, this law was often bent or ignored in practice. Many bishops moved to higher positions, but technically it was prohibited without special dispensation. And Formosus, having been Bishop of Porto, had then become Pope, Bishop of Rome. From a strict legal standpoint, this could be considered a violation. Of course, this charge had never been applied to popes before. Many popes had previously been bishops of other sees before being elected to Rome. The charge was being selectively applied to Formosus because his enemies needed a legal pretext. The deacon standing behind Formosus's throne provides an answer, speaking in a trembling voice. Whether trembling from fear, revulsion at having to speak for a corpse, or the cold of the unheated basilica, we can't know. I was compelled by force. I did not seek the papacy willingly, but was elevated to it by the will of the clergy and people of Rome. This is probably close to the truth. Papal elections in this period were often contentious, with different factions pushing their candidates. Formosus likely did have supporters who pushed for his election, and claiming he was reluctant was a conventional defense. Ambitious men were supposed to be reluctant to take high office, accepting only when compelled by duty. But Stephen doesn't accept this answer. He continues with more accusations. You conspired against your lawful superiors. You sought to undermine the authority of the emperor. You crowned a foreign usurper in defiance of the rightful Emperor Lambert. This is the real issue, of course. Formosus's worst crime, in Stephen's eyes, is that he crowned Arnulf instead of accepting Lambert. This is treason, not against the church per se, but against the political order that Stephen and his backers support. You perjured yourself. You swore an oath never to return to Rome, and you violated that sacred oath. This refers to the oath Formosus made to Pope John VIII when his excommunication was lifted back in 878. He'd promised not to return to Rome. He'd eventually returned anyway, probably arguing that the oath became void when John VIII died, or that circumstances changed, or that he'd been released from it. But technically, he'd broken an oath. The charges go on. Formosus is accused of various crimes and irregularities, consecrating bishops improperly. The accusation is that some of Formosus's episcopal appointments were canonically invalid, either because he appointed men who were unworthy, or because he didn't follow proper procedures, or simply because he appointed supporters of Arnulf over supporters of Lambert, distributing church property inappropriately. This probably means he gave church offices, revenues, and positions to his supporters rather than to the right people, meaning Stephen's faction, sowing discord in the church, a catch-all charge meaning he caused conflict and division by his policies. Throughout the trial, Stephen rages at the corpse. Eyewitness accounts, and yes, people who were there wrote about what they saw, describe Stephen as nearly hysterical, shouting accusations, his face red with anger, seemingly possessed by fury at the silent cadaver sitting across from him. The deacon behind the throne provides feeble defenses, but they're not meant to be convincing. This is show trial. The verdict is predetermined. The evidence is whatever Stephen says it is. Witnesses are called, or rather, people who weren't really witnesses, but who will testify to Formosus's alleged crimes. They describe his supposed violations, his political machinations, his betrayals. None of it is cross-examined or seriously challenged. At intervals, the assembly of bishops and clergy is asked to give judgment. Are these charges proven? Should Formosus be found guilty? Many in the assembly are horrified by what they're witnessing. Some believe this is sacrilege, a desecration of the dead, a mockery of church law. Some know that Formosus's supposed crimes were really just political differences being reframed as canonical violations. But many are also afraid. Stephen VI is the living pope. He has the backing of Ageltrud and Lambert's armies. Those who defend Formosus or question the proceedings might find themselves accused of complicity in his crimes. They might be deposed from their offices, excommunicated, imprisoned, even killed. So most stay silent or murmur their assent when asked. A few brave souls may protest. The sources hint that some did object to the proceedings, but they're shouted down or intimidated into silence. The trial goes on for hours, possibly even days. The sources aren't clear on the exact duration. Stephen continues to rant at the corpse. More accusations are piled on. More witnesses testify. The assembly is repeatedly asked to confirm Formosus's guilt. Finally, the verdict is pronounced. Guilty. On all charges. Pope Formosus is declared to have been an illegitimate pope. His election was invalid. His acts as pope are null and void. His ordinations of priests and bishops are invalidated, meaning everyone he ordained is no longer validly ordained and must be reordained. His coronation of Arnulf as emperor is declared invalid. Arnulf was never really emperor. The sentence is pronounced. First, Formosus is to be stripped of his papal vestments. The elaborate robes are torn from the corpse, leaving it in a simple tunic or possibly naked. Second, the 3 fingers of his right hand that were used in blessing, the thumb, index, and middle finger, are to be cut off. This is symbolic mutilation, destroying the very fingers that made papal blessings, that consecrated the Eucharist, that bestowed ordinations. Someone, a deacon or perhaps an executioner brought in for the purpose, approaches the corpse with a knife or cleaver, takes the right hand, and cuts off the 3 fingers. The desiccated or partially decomposed fingers are severed. They fall to the floor or are held up for the assembly to see, physical proof that the criminal has been punished. Third, Formosus's body is to be stripped of papal burial honors. He will not rest in the church as a pope. His remains are common, not sacred. The corpse is dragged from the throne. Yes, dragged. Witnesses describe the body being pulled across the floor of the basilica, out through the doors, through the streets of Rome. Can you imagine the scene? A former pope's decomposing body being dragged through the streets like a criminal's. People watching in horror or fascination or triumph, depending on their faction. The body leaving a trail of decay, of torn clothing, of the last remnants of dignity being stripped away. The corpse is taken to a cemetery for foreigners. not even granted burial in Rome proper, but cast out to where non-Romans were buried. A grave is dug hastily, probably shallow, and the body dumped in without ceremony, without proper Christian burial rites, treated as refuse. But even this isn't the end of the corpse's journey, because the desecration of Formosus's body was about to take an even darker turn. The trial was over. Formosus had been judged guilty. His body had been mutilated, dragged through the streets, and buried in a foreign cemetery like a criminal or a pauper. One might think this would satisfy Stephen VI and his supporters, but it didn't, because burying Formosus, even dishonorably, still meant his body was in the ground in Rome, even if not in sacred ground. His corpse was still within the city, still in some sense present, and there were rumors that Formosus's supporters, those clergy and nobility who had backed him and who were horrified by the trial, were planning to exhume the body again and give it proper burial. Perhaps they wanted to take it to Porto, Formosus's original diocese, where he might be received with honor. Perhaps they simply wanted to give him Christian burial rites that had been denied. Whatever the case, Stephen's faction decided the body needed to be gotten rid of more completely. It needed to disappear in a way that would prevent any future veneration, any possibility of treating Formosus as a martyr. So on Stephen's orders, or perhaps on the initiative of his more zealous supporters, the body was exhumed again from the foreign cemetery. This would be perhaps a week or two after the trial, so now the corpse had been buried twice and exhumed twice in the space of a couple of weeks. Each exhumation would have accelerated its decomposition, exposed it to air and handling that would break it down further. The corpse was dragged to the Tiber River, that ancient river that flows through Rome, that had witnessed so much of Roman history, from the founding of the city through the empire to this medieval degradation. And there, probably at night, probably with few witnesses, Formosus's body was thrown into the river, not buried at sea with ceremony, not committed to the waters with prayers, simply thrown in like garbage, like waste, to be carried away by the current. The body entered the Tiber. The current took it. It floated downstream, probably breaking apart as it went, bits of decomposed flesh separating, bones perhaps becoming exposed and scattered. Now, this is where the story becomes even stranger, because we have multiple sources that claim what happened next. And while the sources differ on some details, they agree on the basic outline, which is this. The body was recovered. Not immediately. The corpse floated downstream for some distance, perhaps miles. Eventually it washed up on the banks of the Tiber, possibly getting caught in reeds or debris, coming to rest on the muddy shore. And there it was found. Different sources give different accounts of who found it. One version says it was found by a monk who had been a supporter of Formosus. This monk, recognizing the papal vestments, or perhaps recognizing the body itself despite its condition, realized what he'd found. Horrified and moved by compassion, he pulled the body from the river and gave it secret burial in a monastery or church. Another version says it was found by fishermen who were casting nets in the Tiber. They hauled up the corpse along with their catch, realized it was a human body, and reported it to church authorities. A third version says the body washed up near a church, where clergy found it, and examining it closely, identified it as Formosus from some remaining identifying feature, perhaps remnants of papal clothing, perhaps physical features that someone who had known him could recognize. Whichever version is true, and we'll never know for certain, the crucial point is that the body was recovered and identified as Formosus. And this is where the story takes on an element of miracle, at least in how it was later told, because the sources, particularly those favorable to Formosus, claim that when the body was pulled from the Tiber, miracles occurred. The exact nature of the miracles varies in the telling. Some sources claim that as soon as the body was recovered, statues and images in nearby churches began to bow or incline as if in reverence to the martyred pope. Some claim that the bells of churches began to ring spontaneously without human hands pulling the ropes, the bells themselves announcing that a wronged pope had returned. Some claim that the sick and crippled who touched Formosus's body or prayed near it were healed of their ailments. Some claim that the Tiber itself behaved strangely, that the current reversed, or the water became clear instead of muddy, or fish leapt from the water in vast numbers, as if nature itself was responding to the desecration of the Pope's body and its miraculous recovery. Now, we should be skeptical of miracle claims, especially ones reported in sources written decades or even centuries after the events by people with agendas. Medieval chronicle writers often embellished stories with miraculous elements to make theological points or to support their faction's position. But the miracle stories tell us something important. Many people in Rome were horrified by what Stephen VI had done. The Cadaver Synod was seen by many not as just political theatre or even as brutal revenge, but as sacrilege, a violation of sacred norms, a desecration of the dead, an abuse of papal authority that was itself criminal. The miracle stories were a way of expressing this. They were a way of saying, God himself vindicated Formosus. The natural order itself rejected what Stephen did. The universe bore witness that Stephen was wrong and Formosus was martyred. Whether any actual unusual events occurred, whether church bells really did ring unexpectedly, whether there really were healings, whether anything objectively strange happened, we can't know. But the circulation of these stories tells us that public opinion was turning against Stephen VI. The recovery of Formosus's body from the Tiber became a rallying point. It became proof that Stephen had gone too far, and it emboldened Stephen's enemies. Because Stephen had enemies. He'd always had enemies, the supporters of Formosus, those who benefited from Formosus's appointments and policies. But now he'd created more enemies, those who were genuinely horrified by the Cadaver Synod on religious grounds, who felt that putting a corpse on trial was an obscene mockery of church justice. Even some of Lambert's supporters began to distance themselves. Yes, they'd wanted Formosus's policies reversed, but the spectacle had gone too far. It made Rome look insane to the outside world. Christian rulers in other countries heard about the corpse trial and were appalled. The papacy's reputation was being damaged, and there was fear. If Stephen VI could do this to Formosus, a pope who had died and should have been safe from earthly revenge, what might he do to the living? Who else might he turn on? Any bishop or clergy member who had worked with Formosus might be targeted. The Cadaver Synod created an atmosphere of terror, but terror is a double-edged sword. It can make people submit, but it can also make them desperate enough to fight back. Sometime after the recovery of Formosus's body, probably within a few months, opposition to Stephen VI coalesced. We don't know exactly who organized it or how it was coordinated, but there was a plot. Formosus's supporters, combined with those simply disgusted by Stephen's actions, moved against him. There may have been a popular uprising, Roman mobs storming the Lateran Palace. There may have been a coup by clergy and nobles who withdrew their support from Stephen. There may have been intervention by armed factions loyal to different noble families. However it happened, sometime in the summer of 897, probably July or August, about 6 or 7 months after the Cadaver Synod, Pope Stephen VI was overthrown. He was seized and imprisoned, and then he was strangled in his cell. The sources are consistent on this. Stephen VI was murdered by strangulation, probably by political enemies who wanted to ensure he couldn't retake power. Some sources say he was strangled to death. Others say he was strangled to the point of unconsciousness and then thrown into prison, where he died from his injuries or was finished off later. Either way, the man who had put a corpse on trial was himself dead within a year, murdered by those who found his actions intolerable. Pope Stephen VI was buried. We don't know where. Unlike Formosus, his body wasn't exhumed and put on trial. But also unlike Formosus, he wasn't accorded much honor. He was simply gotten rid of, his body disposed of, his brief and notorious pontificate ended. And the question became, what do we do now? How does the Church move forward from this insanity? When Stephen VI was murdered in mid 897, the papacy faced a crisis of legitimacy that went beyond normal succession disputes. The Cadaver Synod had shaken the foundations of papal authority. How could anyone respect the papacy when popes were digging up their predecessors and putting corpses on trial? How could the Church claim moral authority when it was engaging in desecration and show trials? The immediate question was, who becomes the next pope? and more specifically, which faction controls the papacy now that Stephen is dead. Stephen's death suggested that the pro-Formosus faction had gained the upper hand, at least temporarily. Those who were disgusted by the Cadaver Synod, those who had supported Formosus in life, and those who simply wanted to distance the church from Stephen's excesses, formed a coalition strong enough to overthrow him. After Stephen's death, there was a rapid succession of short-lived popes, each trying to navigate the impossible politics of post-Cadaver Synod Rome. Romanus was elected in August 897 and reigned for 4 months before being deposed and possibly murdered. We know almost nothing about his brief pontificate. He may have tried to reverse some of Stephen VI's acts, or he may have been too weak or too cautious to take a clear position. Either way, he didn't last long. Theodore II was elected in December 897 and reigned for only 20 days before dying, possibly natural death given his age, possibly murder. But in those 20 days, he made a critical decision. He convened a synod that formally annulled the Cadaver Synod. This was huge. A new pope, with the support of bishops and clergy, declared that the trial of Formosus's corpse had been invalid. The charges were dismissed. The conviction was overturned. Everything that Stephen VI had done at the Cadaver Synod was declared null and void. More than that, Theodore II ordered that Formosus's body, which had been recovered from the Tiber and given secret burial by his supporters, should be retrieved and given proper burial with full papal honors. So for the third time, Formosus's body was exhumed. But this time, it was done with reverence. Clergy in proper vestments, with prayers and incense, carefully removed the remains from wherever they had been hidden. The body, now nearly 2 years dead, having been buried and exhumed multiple times, having been mutilated and thrown in a river, was in terrible condition. But whatever remained was treated with the dignity due to a pope. The body was vested again in papal robes. It was brought in procession to St. Peter's Basilica, not the current St. Peter's, which wouldn't be built until the Renaissance, but the original 4th century basilica built by Constantine. And there, Formosus's remains were reburied in the Vatican necropolis, where popes were traditionally laid to rest. This reburial was a powerful symbolic statement. Formosus was a legitimate pope. He deserved papal burial. The Cadaver Synod had been a travesty, and now justice was being done, even if only for a corpse. Theodore II died after only 20 days, so he didn't live to see much of the reversal implemented. But his successor, John IX, who became pope in January 898, continued and expanded the rehabilitation of Formosus. John IX convened a synod, a proper synod, with living participants, following actual church law. This synod formally, first, declared that the Cadaver Synod had been invalid. Putting a corpse on trial was declared to be contrary to church law and human decency. Future synods were forbidden from judging the dead. This was now explicitly prohibited. You couldn't put a dead person on trial, period. Second, reinstated Formosus's acts as pope. All the bishops and priests he had ordained were declared to be validly ordained after all. His decrees and decisions were considered legitimate. His coronation of Arnulf as emperor was, well, this was tricky. Arnulf was now dead or dying, and the political situation had changed. But the synod didn't explicitly invalidate the coronation, which left things diplomatically ambiguous. Third, declared that Stephen VI's actions at the Cadaver Synod were themselves invalid. Stephen had exceeded his authority, violated church law, and committed sacrilege. Some argued Stephen himself should be declared illegitimate as pope, though this didn't formally happen. The Church has always been reluctant to declare past popes invalid because it creates too many theological problems. Fourth, established new rules about how papal succession should work, trying to prevent future situations where rival factions could so easily overthrow and destroy each other. The Synod tried to create mechanisms for resolving disputes without violence and desecration. John IX's Synod didn't solve all the problems. Roman politics remained violent and chaotic for centuries, but it did at least officially close the book on the Cadaver Synod, declaring it an aberration, an abuse that must never be repeated. But that wasn't the end of the instability. because now the pro-Spoleto faction, which had backed Stephen VI, was angry about the reversal. They'd gotten what they wanted at the Cadaver Synod. Formosus declared illegitimate, his acts invalidated. Now all of that was being undone. In 898, there was another coup attempt. The Spoleto faction tried to seize control of Rome and install their own pope. They managed to get Sergius III elected as an antipope, a rival claimant to the papacy who was opposed to John IX. Sergius III was a hardliner from the pro-Spoleto faction. He had actually participated in the Cadaver Synod as a bishop, supporting Stephen VI's prosecution of Formosus's corpse. Now he claimed that John IX's reversal of the Cadaver Synod was itself invalid. According to Sergius, Formosus really was guilty, the trial really was legitimate, and the current pope, John IX, was himself illegitimate. But Sergius's coup failed. He didn't have enough military support to hold Rome. John IX's supporters, probably backed by armed force from allies outside Rome, drove Sergius out. Sergius fled and spent the next few years in exile, bitterly maintaining that he was the true pope. John IX remained in power, continued his policies, and eventually died of natural causes in 900 AD after reigning for about 2 years. His successors continued the reversal of the Cadaver Synod and the rehabilitation of Formosus's memory. But the story still wasn't over, because Sergius III, the antipope who'd been driven out, the hardline supporter of the Cadaver Synod, didn't give up. He waited. He built alliances. He stayed in contact with the Spoleto faction and other supporters. And in 904, 7 years after the Cadaver Synod, Sergius got his chance. Through a combination of political maneuvering, armed force, and probably murders, the Spoleto faction managed to seize control of Rome again. The reigning pope, Leo V, was overthrown and imprisoned. An antipope named Christopher briefly claimed power, but was also overthrown. And Sergius III marched into Rome with armed supporters, declared himself the legitimate pope, and seized the Lateran palace. He had his rivals murdered in prison. Leo V and Christopher were both killed, probably by strangulation or stabbing. Sergius III reigned as pope from 904 to 911, 7 years of rule by a man who believed the Cadaver Synod had been right and just. One of the first things Sergius did as pope was to reverse the reversal. He declared that John IX's synod had been invalid. The Cadaver Synod, he proclaimed, had been legitimate. Formosus was guilty. His acts were invalid. Did Sergius dig up Formosus's body again and put it on trial a second time? No, even Sergius wasn't that crazy, or perhaps he recognized that repeating the spectacle would be politically counterproductive. But he did formally reinstate the Cadaver Synod's verdicts. In Sergius's official view, Formosus was a condemned criminal, not a legitimate pope. Sergius also had a curious inscription placed in St. Peter's Basilica. It praised Sergius for his defense of the faith and included language that seemed to justify the prosecution of Formosus. The inscription positioned Sergius as a righteous pope who'd correctly identified and punished a criminal predecessor. But Sergius couldn't actually undo everything John IX had done. The ordinations that Formosus had performed were still accepted throughout Christendom. Churches outside Rome had never stopped recognizing them, and it would have been chaos to try to force every bishop and priest ordained by Formosus to be reordained. So in practice, even though Sergius officially condemned Formosus, the practical effects of that condemnation were limited. Sergius III died in 911, and after his death, the issue of Formosus's legitimacy gradually faded. Later popes didn't bring it up again. The condemnation wasn't formally reversed a second time, but neither was it reinforced. It was simply let go. The church moved on. Formosus's body remained buried in St. Peter's, where Theodore II had reburied it. No one exhumed it again. Over the following centuries, as St. Peter's Basilica was rebuilt and renovated, the exact location of Formosus's tomb was lost. Today, we don't know where his bones lie, somewhere in the Vatican necropolis, mixed with dozens of other popes from the early medieval period, indistinguishable from them. In later papal lists, official lists of popes maintained by the Church, Formosus is included as a legitimate pope who reigned from 891 to 896. The Cadaver Synod is treated as an aberration, an abuse by Stephen VI that was quickly reversed and condemned. But the Cadaver Synod itself is remembered. Oh, is it remembered? Because even in an age when popes were regularly murdered, deposed, and mutilated, even in an era when violence and political intrigue were normal parts of papal history, the Cadaver Synod stood out as uniquely bizarre and horrible. The image of a corpse dressed in papal robes, propped on a throne, being screamed at by a living pope, while a terrified deacon provided answers from behind the throne. This image captured imaginations. It became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the papacy in this dark period. It became shorthand for the corruption and violence of the age. Later church reformers, when they wanted to argue that the papacy needed to be purified and removed from secular political control, would point to the Cadaver Synod as an example of how bad things had gotten. Look what happens, they'd say, when popes are controlled by secular factions and Roman noble families. Look at the depths to which the church can sink. Protestant reformers in the 16th century loved the story of the Cadaver Synod. Martin Luther, John Calvin, and other critics of the Catholic Church used it as propaganda. See, the papacy has always been corrupt. They put corpses on trial. How can you claim divine authority when you commit such atrocities? And even within the Catholic Church, the Cadaver Synod was remembered as a shameful episode. Catholic historians and theologians didn't deny it happened. Too many sources confirmed it. But they tried to minimize it, to explain it as an aberration caused by unusual political circumstances, to insist that it didn't represent the true nature of the papacy. In art and literature, the Cadaver Synod became a popular subject. Medieval and Renaissance artists depicted the scene, the living pope screaming at the corpse, the horrified bishops watching, the grotesque spectacle of desecrated death. Writers used it as a Gothic horror story, a tale of madness and revenge that seemed too bizarre to be true, but was. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as historical methods became more sophisticated, scholars studied the Cadaver Synod carefully, trying to understand what really happened and why. They placed it in political context, showing how it grew out of the factional struggles of late 9th century Rome. They analyzed the sources, trying to separate fact from legend, reality from later embellishment. And what they found was that the basic story is true. It really happened. Pope Stephen VI really did exhume his predecessor's corpse and put it on trial. The grotesque details, the corpse on the throne, the mutilation of the fingers, the body thrown in the Tiber, these aren't inventions of later hostile sources. They're confirmed by multiple independent sources from close to the time of the events. The Cadaver Synod happened. The only real question is, why? So we come to the central question, why would Pope Stephen VI do this? Why exhume a corpse and put it on trial? What could possibly justify such a bizarre and grotesque act? The easy answer, the one that many people go with, is madness. Stephen VI must have been insane. The Cadaver Synod was the act of a lunatic who'd somehow become pope, a psychotic break manifesting as religious theatre. And there's some support for this view. The sources describe Stephen as seemingly unhinged during the trial, screaming at the corpse with what appears to be genuine rage and hatred, seemingly unable to distinguish between a dead body and a living person. Some historians have speculated he had a mental illness, perhaps paranoia, perhaps a psychotic disorder. But I think the madness explanation, while satisfying in its simplicity, is ultimately too easy. It absolves us of having to understand the actual political, religious, and cultural context that made the Cadaver Synod not just possible, but, in a twisted way, logical. Because the Cadaver Synod wasn't just random madness. It was purposeful. It accomplished specific political goals. And it made sense. Horrible, grotesque, desecrating sense within the context of 9th century Rome. Let's break down the reasons why Stephen VI and his supporters staged the Cadaver Synod. First, and most obviously, political necessity. Stephen owed his papacy to the Spoleto faction, particularly to Lambert and his mother Ageltrude. They had put him in power. They expected results. And the result they wanted was the complete delegitimization of Formosus's pontificate. Why? Because Formosus had declared that Lambert wasn't the legitimate emperor. Formosus had crowned Arnulf instead. As long as Formosus's acts as pope were considered legitimate, there was always a question about Lambert's legitimacy as emperor. Arnulf's supporters could claim that he'd been properly crowned while Lambert hadn't. By putting Formosus on trial and convicting him, Stephen could declare that nothing Formosus did as pope was valid. Arnulf's coronation, invalid. Lambert was the rightful emperor after all. Any bishops or clergy that Formosus had appointed to support his policies, their appointments were invalid too, and they could be replaced with Spoleto loyalists. This was about consolidating power. It was about rewriting recent history to favor the winning faction. And it's not actually that different from what many political regimes do after taking power. They discredit the previous government, declare its acts invalid, and purge its supporters. The unusual part was that it involved a corpse, but that leads to our second reason. Second, religious and legal necessity. How do you invalidate a previous pope's acts? In the Catholic theological system, the pope is the vicar of Christ, guided by the Holy Spirit. When the Pope makes official pronouncements on faith or morals, he's considered infallible, incapable of error, because God protects him from teaching falsehood. Now, this doctrine of papal infallibility wasn't formally defined until 1870, but the basic idea existed much earlier. Popes have special authority and protection from God. So how do you say a previous pope was wrong without undermining the entire basis of papal authority? The answer is to argue that he wasn't really a legitimate pope in the first place. If you can show that Formosus violated canon law in becoming pope, if he broke his oath not to return to Rome, if he abandoned his diocese of Porto, if he was technically still under the excommunication from John VII, then you can argue his papacy was invalid from the start. He wasn't really pope, so he didn't have papal authority, so his acts don't carry papal weight. But to make this argument convincingly, you need a formal proceeding. You need a trial where charges are presented, evidence is given, and a verdict is rendered. Just declaring Formosus was illegitimate isn't enough. You need the appearance of due process, even if the process is rigged. And who's the defendant in this trial? Formosus. But he's dead. So what do? You get his body and put it on trial. You create a legal fiction that the corpse represents the person, that trying the body is equivalent to trying the man. This is bizarre to us, but it wasn't completely unprecedented in medieval law. There were cases of criminals who died before trial being posthumously tried and convicted, with their bodies exhumed and punished. The logic was that the person's crimes needed to be officially condemned, and the body was the closest thing to the person that still existed. Stephen was applying criminal law logic to a church proceeding. It was a grotesque innovation, but it had a certain twisted legal logic to it. Third, theatrical necessity. Stephen needed to convince people, the Roman population, the clergy, foreign rulers, that Formosus really was guilty and his pontificate really was illegitimate. Abstract theological arguments wouldn't accomplish this. Legal documents wouldn't accomplish this. What would accomplish it was spectacle. By staging the Cadaver Synod in the Great Basilica, by having bishops and clergy witness it, by creating a visceral, memorable, shocking scene, Stephen ensured that everyone would know what verdict had been reached. The image of the corpse on trial would stick in people's minds. It would be talked about, remembered, impossible to ignore. This was propaganda through spectacle. It was meant to be disturbing, meant to be unforgettable, meant to drive home the message. Formosus was a criminal so vile that even his corpse had to answer for his crimes. Fourth, personal hatred and revenge. We shouldn't discount the personal element. Stephen apparently genuinely hated Formosus. Whether this was because Formosus had opposed Stephen's elevation, or because there was bad blood between them from earlier conflicts, or simply because Stephen had fully internalized the propaganda of his faction, he seems to have harbored intense personal animosity. The descriptions of Stephen raging at the corpse, screaming accusations, trembling with anger, these suggest genuine emotion beyond political calculation. Stephen may have really believed that Formosus was evil, that he'd betrayed the church, that he deserved not just political defeat, but utter destruction. Revenge is a powerful motivator, and if you can dress up personal revenge in the garments of political necessity and legal process, so much the better. Fifth, intimidation and terror. The Cadaver Synod sent a message to everyone in Rome. This is what happens to our enemies. Even death doesn't protect you. Even the grave doesn't save you from our revenge. We will dig you up and destroy you posthumously if necessary. This is psychological warfare. It's meant to make potential opponents think, if they'll do this to a pope who's already dead, what will they do to me while I'm still alive? It creates an atmosphere of terror where people are afraid to resist because resistance seems futile. Your enemies might destroy you even after you're dead. We see this same tactic used by modern authoritarian regimes. Stalin purged people who'd been dead for years, erasing them from photographs and records, making them unpersons in Orwellian fashion. Mao's Red Guards desecrated grave of historical figures deemed ideologically impure. These aren't acts of madness. They're calculated uses of terror and historical erasure as political tools. Stephen was doing something similar. The Cadaver Synod was meant to terrorize opponents into submission. Sixth, religious belief in the power of cursing and pollution. This is perhaps the hardest reason for modern people to understand, but I think it's important. Medieval people had very different beliefs about bodies, death, and spiritual pollution than we do. There was a belief that the bodies of holy people retained holiness and could work miracles. This is why relics, bones, or other body parts of saints were so important and valuable. Saints' bodies were conduits of divine power. But the flip side of this belief was that the bodies of evil people retained evil. A criminal's body might be desecrated or denied proper burial to prevent any lingering evil influence. In extreme cases, bodies were exhumed and destroyed. If you believed that Formosus was a criminal pope who defiled his office, you might also believe that his body retained some kind of spiritual pollution. By exhuming it, trying it, condemning it, mutilating it, and throwing it in the river, you were not just symbolically destroying his legacy. You were literally removing his corrupting influence from Rome. This sounds like superstition to modern ears, but to medieval Christians, the spiritual realm was just as real as the physical realm. Cursing Formosus's body might have seemed like a genuine act of spiritual purification. Seventh, precedent and tradition. While the Cadaver Synod was unprecedented in its specifics, there was a tradition of posthumous condemnation in both Roman law and church law. Roman emperors had suffered damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory, where their names were chiseled off monuments and their acts reversed after death. Church councils had posthumously condemned heretics, declaring that they died outside the church and shouldn't be honored. Stephen was taking these traditions to an extreme, but he was working within a recognizable pattern. The difference was that he made the posthumous condemnation literal. He brought the actual body to trial rather than just issuing a posthumous condemnation. So when we ask, why did Stephen VI do this? The answer is, it was politically necessary to invalidate Formosus's acts. It was legally useful to create a formal proceeding. It was theatrically effective to create an unforgettable spectacle. It was personally satisfying to take revenge on an enemy. It was strategically valuable to intimidate opponents. It was spiritually justified, in Stephen's mind, to purify Rome of Formosus's corrupting influence, and it fit within existing traditions of posthumous condemnation. Put all of that together, and the Cadaver Synod stops looking like incomprehensible madness and starts looking like horrible logic. It was an extreme act, yes. It was grotesque and shocking, yes. But it wasn't random or inexplicable. It was a calculated political move that used shock value and desecration as tools of power. That, in some ways, is more disturbing than if Stephen had simply been insane, because it means the Cadaver Synod wasn't an aberration. It was an extreme version of politics as usual in 9th century Rome. And that brings us to a broader question. What does the Cadaver Synod tell us about the papacy in this period? What does it reveal about how power functioned, how religion and politics intertwined, how far people would go to maintain control. The Cadaver Synod didn't happen in isolation. It wasn't a bizarre one-off event that can be separated from the rest of papal history. It was, instead, a particularly vivid example of a much broader problem. The papacy in the 9th, 10th, and early 11th centuries was deeply corrupted by secular power politics. Historians call this period the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Age, or sometimes more colourfully, the Pornocracy. This latter term, meaning rule by prostitutes, is probably unfair and misogynistic. It comes from the fact that several powerful Roman noble women wielded enormous influence over papal appointments in this period, and hostile male chroniclers characterized these women as prostitutes or immoral seductresses, rather than acknowledging them as skilled political operators. But whatever we call it, this was a low point for the papacy. Between roughly 880 and 1050, the papal office was dominated by Roman noble families who treated it as a prize to be captured and controlled, not as a spiritual office to be honored and respected. Let me give you a sense of just how violent and chaotic papal history was in this period by listing some of the popes who reigned in the century after the Cadaver Synod and what happened to them. John X 940–928, a capable pope who actually led armies in battle against Muslim raiders. But he was eventually deposed by the Theophylact family, imprisoned in Castel Sant'Angelo, and murdered, either smothered or starved to death in his cell. Leo VI 928 reigned for 7 months before dying, possibly murdered, possibly natural causes. We know almost nothing about his brief pontificate. Stephen VII 928–931 reigned for about 2 years, possibly deposed, possibly died naturally. Sources are unclear because he wasn't important enough for chroniclers to care. John XI 931–935, the illegitimate son of Popes Sergius III and Marozia, one of the most powerful women in Rome. John became pope because his mother arranged it. When Marozia's enemies imprisoned her, John was also imprisoned and died in captivity, still technically pope, but completely powerless. Leo VII 936–939 reigned 3 years, one of the few popes in this period who might have died of natural causes, though even this isn't certain. Stephen VII 939–942 reigned 3 years, was horribly mutilated. His face was disfigured, possibly his nose and ears cut off, by rival factions. He survived, but was so disfigured that he could no longer serve effectively as pope. Some sources say he died of his injuries, others that he was deposed. Marinus II 942–946 reigned 4 years, possibly dying of natural causes. Another of the lucky ones if dying in office counts as lucky. Agapetus II 946–955 reigned 9 years, relatively long for this period. Apparently died naturally in old age. His reign was marked by constant political struggles, but he somehow survived them. John XII 955–964 became pope at age 18 because his father, Alberic II, was the secular ruler of Rome and arranged for his son to inherit both secular and religious power. John XII lived a notoriously immoral life. Accusations included adultery, incest, drinking toasts to the devil, ordaining a 10-year-old boy as bishop, and turning the Lateran Palace into a brothel. He was eventually deposed by the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I, but tried to retake Rome with an army. He died at age 27. Some sources say he died in bed with a married woman, either of a stroke or murdered by the woman's husband. Benedict V 964 reigned just 1 month before being deposed by the Emperor Otto I, who favored a different candidate. Benedict was exiled to Hamburg, where he died the next year. Leo VII 964–965, an antipope installed by Emperor Ott I in opposition to Benedict V. His legitimacy was disputed. Reigned just over a year. John XII 965–972, supported by Otto I, which protected him from some Roman factions but made him hated by others. He was briefly overthrown and exiled by a Roman uprising in 965. But Otto's armies retook Rome and restored John, who then took brutal revenge on his opponents, died after 7 years, possibly murdered. I could continue this list through the rest of the 10th century and into the 11th. The pattern is clear. Popes are murdered, deposed, mutilated, imprisoned, exiled. Average reign lengths are short, usually just a few years. Many popes are tools of noble families or foreign emperors with little independent authority. The Cadaver Synod fits perfectly into this pattern. It's not an inexplicable aberration. It's an extreme example of what happens when the papacy is controlled by secular factions willing to use any means, including desecration of the dead, to consolidate their power. But we should be careful not to paint this entire period with too broad a brush. Not every pope in this era was evil or incompetent. Some were genuinely pious men who tried to do good despite the impossible political situation they found themselves in. Some were skilled administrators who managed the church's affairs competently, even while navigating deadly political waters. And even at its worst, the papacy continued to function as a religious institution. Churches were built and maintained. Monasteries continued their work. Bishops administered their dioceses. Priests said Mass and administered sacraments. Monks copied manuscripts, preserving ancient knowledge. The basic work of the Church continued even while its leadership was mired in violence and corruption. Moreover, we should remember that this was the reality of power everywhere in this period, not just in Rome. Medieval kingship was violent. Emperors, kings, and nobles throughout Europe were murdering each other, breaking oaths, betraying allies, and using religion as a tool of political legitimacy. The papacy was deeply enmeshed in temporal power struggles because that's what all institutions with power were doing. The difference, and this is crucial, is that the papacy claimed to be different. It claimed spiritual authority. It claimed to represent Christ on earth. It claimed to be above the sordid power politics of secular rulers. And that claim was revealed as hollow when popes were putting corpses on trial, when they were being murdered and mutilated, when they were clearly tools of noble families and foreign emperors. This created a crisis of legitimacy that thoughtful Christians recognized. Reform movements began emerging, arguing that the church needed to be purified, that the papacy needed to be freed from secular control. The most important reform movement was centered in monasteries, particularly the monastery of Cluny in France, founded in 910. The Cluniac reform movement emphasized proper religious observance, clerical celibacy, freedom from lay control, and moral purity. Cluniac monasteries spread across Europe, creating a network of reformed religious houses that modeled what the church could be if it wasn't corrupted by politics. These reformers looked at the Cadaver Synod and similar events as proof of why reform was necessary. They used these scandals as propaganda for their reform agenda. See what happens when the church is controlled by secular powers. See how low we've fallen. We need to restore the church to its proper spiritual mission. It would take centuries, but the reform movement eventually succeeded in transforming the papacy. By the late 11th century, reform popes like Leo IX and Gregory VII were asserting papal independence from secular control, insisting on clerical celibacy, fighting against simony, buying and selling church offices, and generally trying to create a church that actually lived up to its spiritual claims. The pinnacle of this reformed papacy came in the 12th and 13th centuries with popes like Innocent III, who wielded enormous spiritual and political authority, but based on reformed principles and genuine, if imperfect, moral authority rather than pure naked power politics. But the Cadaver Synod remained in memory as a cautionary tale. It was what the church had been at its worst, and reformers used it as a reminder, never again. Never let the church sink so low again. Never let political revenge and factional hatred become more important than spiritual mission. The Cadaver Synod also raises deeper questions about the nature of the papacy itself, questions that were debated in the Middle Ages and continue to be debated by historians and theologians today. If a pope can do something like the Cadaver Synod, if a pope can commit sacrilege, can violate church law, can act out of personal hatred and political calculation rather than spiritual wisdom, does that mean popes aren't really protected by God? Does it mean papal authority is just a useful fiction? Or does it mean that popes, despite their office, remain human and fallible in their personal conduct, even if they're protected from teaching doctrinal error? These are questions the Catholic Church has had to grapple with throughout its history. The doctrine of papal infallibility was eventually defined in 1870 at the First Vatican Council, but it was carefully limited. The Pope is only infallible when speaking ex cathedra, from the chair, officially, on matters of faith and morals, intending to bind the whole Church. In all other matters, personal conduct, political decisions, administrative actions, the Pope remains as fallible as any other human. This doctrine was developed partly in response to historical embarrassments like the Cadaver Synod. It was a way of saying, yes, popes have done terrible things. Yes, some popes have been wicked men, but that doesn't invalidate the papal office itself, because the office's essential function, teaching the faith, is protected by God even when the office holder is corrupt. Whether you find this argument convincing probably depends on whether you're Catholic, but it's worth understanding it as the Church's attempt to reconcile historical reality, popes doing bad things, with theological necessity. The Church needs reliable authority. The Protestant reformers, unsurprisingly, found this argument unpersuasive. Martin Luther used the Cadaver Synod as evidence that the papacy was a human institution, not a divine one. If popes could commit such atrocities, Luther argued, they clearly weren't protected by God in any special way, and therefore their claim to supreme authority over the Church was false. The Counter-Reformation Catholic response was essentially, yes, individual popes can be sinners, but the institution of the papacy is still divinely ordained, and bad popes don't invalidate the office any more than bad kings invalidate monarchy or bad judges invalidate courts. These debates about papal authority, about the relationship between divine institution and human failure, about how to reconcile the ideal and the reality of the Church, all of these were sharpened and clarified by historical events like the Cadaver Synod. So the Cadaver Synod's legacy isn't just a grotesque story that shocks and fascinates. It's a case study in how institutions can fail, how power corrupts, how even religious organizations claiming divine authority can descend into politics of the most brutal kind. And it raises questions that remain relevant today, not just for churches, but for any institution that claims moral authority. How do we reconcile our ideals with our failures? How do we acknowledge historical wrongdoing without destroying institutional legitimacy? How do we reform without repudiating everything that came before? These aren't easy questions. The Church is grappling with the legacy of the Cadaver Synod, and similar events shows how difficult they are. But before we draw our final lessons, we need to address one more question. What happened to the physical remains of the two main characters in this drama? Where are Pope Formosus and Pope Stephen VI now, more than 1100 years later? We've followed Pope Formosus's body through an extraordinary journey. Buried with honor as a pope should be in April 896. Exhumed and dragged to trial in January 897. Mutilated, stripped of dignity, buried in a foreigner's cemetery. Exhumed again and thrown in the Tiber River. Recovered from the river, probably in pieces. Reburied secretly by supporters. Exhumed a fourth time for proper reburial by Pope Theodore II in December 897. Finally interred with full honors in St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican. 5 burials, 4 exhumations, 9 months of death before the Cadaver Synod, then another year and a half of posthumous drama before finally being left alone. Where is Formosus now? The honest answer is, we don't know exactly. He's somewhere in the Vatican necropolis, the ancient cemetery beneath St. Peter's Basilica, where popes and other notable Christians were buried in the early centuries of the Church. The original St. Peter's Basilica, built by Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, was constructed over what was believed to be the burial place of Saint Peter himself. Over the centuries, hundreds of popes, bishops, and other important Christians were buried in and around this basilica. When the original basilica was torn down and rebuilt in the 16th and 17th centuries, creating the current St. Peter's Basilica that stands today, many of the tombs were disturbed, moved, or lost. The Renaissance popes were more concerned with building magnificent new architecture than with carefully preserving every ancient tomb. During construction, workers found countless human remains. Some were identified and moved to new tombs. Others couldn't be identified and were reburied in mass grave or ossuaries. Still others were probably simply lost, bones scattered or disposed of during centuries of construction work. Archaeological excavations of the Vatican necropolis in the 20th century revealed an incredibly complex site with multiple layers of burials spanning centuries. Bones are mixed together. Inscriptions are worn away or missing. In many cases, it's impossible to identify whose remains are whose. Formosus is down there somewhere, mixed with hundreds of other early medieval popes, indistinguishable from them now. His bones, or what remains of them after multiple exhumations, after being thrown in a river after more than 11 centuries, are in the necropolis. But we can't point to a specific tomb and say, that's Formosus. In a way, this seems fitting. After all the drama of his body being exhumed and tried and desecrated, after all the political theatre that used his corpse as a prop, Formosus finally found peace in anonymity. His bones rest unknown, unmarked, unremarkable. The Vatican doesn't publicize the location of most ancient papal tombs because they don't know where most of them are. Formosus has no shrine, no elaborate tomb, no place where pilgrims can visit and pay respects. He's simply one of 266 popes in the official list, a name and dates of reign. Formosus, 891–896. What about Stephen VI? His fate is easier to trace, at least initially. After being overthrown and strangled in mid 897, Stephen was buried somewhere in Rome. But unlike Formosus, he wasn't given honored burial in St. Peter's or one of the major basilicas. He was a disgraced pope, overthrown and murdered, and his enemies weren't interested in honoring his memory. We don't know where Stephen was buried. Probably in one of Rome's many churches or cemeteries, in an unmarked grave or with minimal identification. And unlike Formosus, whose tomb was visited by supporters and later by church officials during the various exhumations and reburials, Stephen's grave was apparently immediately forgotten. There's no record of anyone ever visiting Stephen VI's tomb. No one recorded its location. No one mentioned it in chronicles or church records. He simply disappeared from history after his death. Today, we have no idea where Stephen VI's remains are. They could be anywhere in Rome. They might have been destroyed or lost during the many times Rome was sacked, burned, or rebuilt over the following centuries. They might still be in some forgotten tomb, in a church basement or cemetery, completely unidentified and unidentifiable. Like Formosus, Stephen VI has found his final rest in anonymity. But where Formosus's anonymity came after rehabilitation, after his honor was restored and his memory was preserved as a legitimate pope, Stephen's anonymity is the anonymity of disgrace. He's forgotten not because he became indistinguishable from other popes, but because no one wanted to remember him. In official papal lists, Stephen VI is listed as pope from May 896 to August 897, about 15 months. The lists note that his reign ended with his being deposed and killed, but they don't go into detail about the Cadaver Synod. That would be embarrassing. If you visit Rome today and take the official Vatican tour, you won't be shown Stephen VI's tomb because no one knows where it is. You won't be shown Formosus's tomb either, but at least with Formosus, there's the excuse that it's lost somewhere in the necropolis. With Stephen, he's just gone, erased. The church moved on and left him behind. There's a grim irony here. Stephen tried to utterly destroy Formosus's memory by desecrating his corpse, putting it on trial, convicting it, mutilating it, and throwing it in the river. He wanted Formosus erased from history, his acts invalidated, his legacy destroyed. But it's Stephen who's been effectively erased. Formosus is remembered as a legitimate pope, remembered for his complicated political career, remembered for being the victim of the Cadaver Synod. His name is known to history students, to Catholics interested in papal history, to anyone who encounters the story of the Cadaver Synod. Stephen VI is remembered too, but only for one thing: staging the Cadaver Synod. That's his entire legacy. Everything else he did is forgotten. We don't know what his other policies were, what church business he conducted, what sermons he preached. The only thing history remembers about Stephen VI is that he dug up his predecessor and put a corpse on trial. So Stephen's attempt to destroy Formosus's legacy backfired completely. He gave Formosus a kind of immortality. Everyone who learns about the Cadaver Synod remembers the victim, Formosus, who was put on trial after death, and Stephen's own legacy was destroyed by his actions. He's remembered only for committing an atrocity. There's a lesson in this about revenge and its consequences. When you try to destroy your enemy so thoroughly, so completely, so obsessively that you resort to desecrating their corpse, you reveal more about yourself than about them. Stephen wanted to show that Formosus was a criminal. What he actually showed was that he himself was willing to commit sacrilege for political purposes. In Catholic tradition, there's no cult of Formosus. He's not venerated as a saint. There are no feast days honoring him, no churches dedicated to him. But he's also not dishonored. He's simply acknowledged as a pope who reigned during a difficult period, who made controversial political decisions, who was posthumously vindicated when his trial was declared invalid. Stephen VI, meanwhile, is sometimes listed among the bad popes, those popes whose conduct was scandalous or whose reigns were disasters. He's an embarrassment to the Church, a reminder of how low the papacy sank in its darkest periods. Both men died more than 1100 years ago. Both were buried in Rome. Both of their remains are lost or unidentifiable. Both are now just names in history books, dates in chronologies, characters in one of history's strangest stories. And between them, they gave us the Cadaver Synod, an event so bizarre, so grotesque, so revealing of human nature at its worst, that it continues to fascinate and horrify us more than a millennium later. So, what do we take away from the story of the Cadaver Synod? What does this bizarre event from more than 11 centuries ago teach us? On one level, it's simply a fascinating historical anecdote. One of those, truth is stranger than fiction, stories that reminds us that real history is often weirder, more dramatic, and more disturbing than anything we'd invent. It's a great story to tell at parties, a bit of trivia to share, a window into a world so different from ours that it seems almost alien. But I think the Cadaver Synod offers deeper lessons, ones that remain relevant today. First, it teaches us about the corrosive effects of combining religious authority with political power. The papacy in the 9th century claimed to be the spiritual leader of Christendom, the representative of God on earth. But it was also a secular principality, controlling territory, commanding armies, playing power politics with rival Italian nobles and foreign emperors. This combination corrupted the spiritual mission. When your survival as a ruler depends on winning political struggles, when your throne can be taken by armed force, when your legitimacy depends on which noble family backs you, then spiritual considerations become secondary to political necessity. Stephen VI put a corpse on trial not because it was spiritually right or theologically sound, but because it was politically useful. The spiritual authority of the papacy was weaponized for political purposes. We see similar dynamics today whenever religious authority is used as a tool of political power. Whether it's religious leaders blessing authoritarian regimes or theocracies using religious law to consolidate political control, or politicians cynically invoking religion to justify policies, mixing religious and political authority tends to corrupt both. The lesson isn't necessarily that church and state must be completely separated in all circumstances. Different societies have found different balances, but the Cadaver Synod shows us what happens when the balance tips too far toward political power wielded under the guise of spiritual authority. Second, it teaches us about revenge and its consequences. Stephen VI wanted to destroy Formosus so completely that even death wasn't enough to protect his enemy. He wanted to humiliate, to desecrate, to erase Formosus from history. But revenge of this magnitude backfires. It reveals the revenger as someone willing to violate basic norms of decency. It turns the victim into a martyr or at least a sympathetic figure. It creates backlash from those who find the revenge excessive. Stephen's revenge against Formosus ultimately led to his own downfall. It horrified enough people that they turned against him, overthrew him, and killed him. His attempt to destroy Formosus's legacy ensured that Formosus would be remembered, while Stephen himself would be remembered only for committing an atrocity. Modern parallels exist. When governments or groups seek revenge so extreme that it violates basic human dignity, when they desecrate bodies, when they punish the dead, when they erase people from history, they often create backlash that undermines their own authority. Third, it teaches us about the power of spectacle and theatre in politics. The Cadaver Synod was political theatre, a carefully staged performance designed to communicate a message and create a lasting impression. It worked in the sense that everyone remembered it. The image of the corpse on trial stuck in people's minds. It became a defining event, something that couldn't be ignored or forgotten. But spectacle is a dangerous tool because it can't be fully controlled. Stephen wanted the Cadaver Synod to communicate. Formosus was guilty, and I am right. But many people received a different message. Stephen is insane and has violated sacred norms. Modern politics is full of spectacle, carefully staged events, dramatic announcements, symbolic actions designed to communicate messages beyond their literal content. These can be effective, but like the Cadaver Synod, they can also backfire if the spectacle is too extreme or reads differently to different audiences than intended. Fourth, it teaches us about the difference between institutional authority and personal morality. Stephen VI held the highest religious office in Western Christianity. He was the Pope, the Vicar of Christ, the successor of Peter. In theory, he represented ultimate spiritual authority, but having that authority didn't make him a good person. It didn't prevent him from committing sacrilege. It didn't mean his actions were right just because he was Pope. This disconnect between institutional position and personal conduct is something we see in all institutions: religious, political, academic, corporate. A person can hold high office and still act badly. Authority doesn't confer wisdom or virtue. A title doesn't make you right. The Catholic Church's solution, developed over centuries partly in response to events like the Cadaver Synod, is to distinguish between the office and the person. The papal office is protected by God, but individual popes remain fallible humans who can sin. This allows the Church to acknowledge bad popes without invalidating the institution of the papacy. Whether or not you accept this theological argument, the basic insight is valuable. We need to be able to criticize people in authority without necessarily rejecting the institutions they represent. And conversely, we shouldn't assume that someone in authority is right just because of their position. Fifth, it teaches us about the importance of respecting the dead. Every culture has norms about how to treat dead bodies. These vary. Some cultures bury, others cremate, others expose bodies to the elements. But all have the sense that corpses deserve some form of respect or proper treatment. The Cadaver Synod violated these norms in a fundamental way. It treated a corpse as if it were a living criminal, subjecting it to trial and punishment. It exhumed a body not to move it to a better resting place, but to desecrate it. It threw remains in a river like garbage. This was recognized as transgressive even by the standards of the violent 9th century. The horror many contemporaries felt at the Cadaver Synod came partly from the political injustice, but also from the sheer sacrilege of mistreating the dead. Modern examples of desecrating corpses for political purposes: digging up grave, displaying bodies as trophies, mutilating the dead, are universally condemned as atrocities. The Cadaver Synod stands as an early example of why such practices are wrong. They dehumanize not just the victim, but also those who commit them. Sixth, it teaches us about historical contingency and the importance of individual choices. The Cadaver Synod wasn't inevitable. It happened because specific people made specific choices at specific moments. If Formosus hadn't challenged Guy of Spoleto's imperial claim, if he'd accepted Lambert as emperor, the political conflict might not have escalated as it did. If Arnulf had remained healthy after being crowned emperor, he might have imposed order on Italy and protected Formosus's legacy. If Stephen VI had chosen a different way to delegitimize Formosus, abstract theological arguments, a quiet reversal of his policies, the Cadaver Synod might never have happened. If someone in Stephen's circle had said, "This is too far, we can't put a corpse on trial, this will backfire," and if Stephen had listened, history would be different. Small choices by individuals made in the moment accumulate into historical events. The Cadaver Synod wasn't the inevitable result of vast impersonal forces. It was the result of human decisions. This is both terrifying and hopeful. Terrifying because it means individuals can cause enormous damage through bad decisions. Hopeful because it means individuals can also prevent damage through good decisions. Finally, it teaches us humility about human nature and human institutions. The Cadaver Synod happened because human beings, claiming to represent God, holding positions of ultimate authority at the center of the most important religious institution in Western Christianity, committed acts of grotesque sacrilege for political purposes. If this could happen to the papacy at its height of claimed spiritual authority, then no institution is immune to corruption. No amount of noble mission, high ideals, or divine claims can fully protect an institution from human failures. This doesn't mean all institutions are equally corrupt or that we should be cynical about everything. But it does mean we should be realistic. Institutions are run by humans, and humans are capable of terrible things even when they claim the highest principles. The church that produced the Cadaver Synod also produced Francis of Assisi and Thomas Aquinas. The same institution that desecrated corpses for political purposes also built universities, preserved ancient learning through the Dark Ages, and inspired some of the greatest art and architecture in human history. Institutions are complicated. They contain both their best and worst moments, both their noble achievements and their terrible failures. Understanding this complexity, acknowledging both the good and the bad, is essential for mature historical understanding. The Cadaver Synod stands as a permanent reminder that even the most powerful and prestigious institutions can descend into madness when political power, personal revenge, and desperate circumstances combine. It's a warning. It's a case study in how not to exercise authority. It's evidence of how far humans can fall even, or especially, when we claim divine sanction. But it's also, in a strange way, a story of resilience. The Church survived the Cadaver Synod. It was damaged, embarrassed, delegitimized in many eyes. But it reformed, it changed, it moved past this dark chapter. Later medieval popes learned from these failures and worked to create a more independent and morally credible institution. The Cadaver Synod happened. It was real, it was horrible, and it revealed ugly truths about power and human nature. But it wasn't the end of the story. It was a low point from which recovery was possible. And maybe that's ultimately the most important lesson. No matter how badly institutions or individuals fail, no matter how deep they sink into corruption or violence, change is possible. Reform is possible. Moving beyond the past, learning from it rather than being defined by it, is possible. The corpse eventually found rest. The church eventually found reform. And history eventually found meaning in this bizarre event, not as a mere curiosity, but as a profound lesson in power, revenge, spectacle, and the human capacity for both degradation and redemption. It's January 897 AD. In a great basilica in Rome, a corpse sits on a throne, dressed in papal vestments. A living pope screams accusations at the dead. A terrified deacon speaks for the corpse. Bishops watch in horror, fear, or grim satisfaction. This is the Cadaver Synod. This is what happens when power, revenge, and religious authority combine in the worst possible way. This is humanity at its most bizarre and terrible, but it's also just history. It happened. It's real. And more than 1100 years later, we're still talking about it, still trying to understand it, still drawing lessons from it. Pope Formosus and Pope Stephen VI are long dead. Their bodies have crumbled to dust, their bones lost and unidentifiable somewhere in Rome's ancient earth. The political struggles that consumed their lives are forgotten by everyone except historians. The noble families they represented, the emperors they crowned or opposed, the clergy they appointed or deposed, all gone, all dust, all merely names in chronicles. But the story remains. The image of the corpse on trial remains. The question of how people can commit such acts in the name of God remains. And the lesson remains. Power corrupts, revenge destroys, spectacle can backfire, and even the highest authorities are capable of the lowest acts. The Cadaver Synod happened once. Church law was changed to ensure it could never happen again. No more posthumous trials, no more digging up bodies to prosecute them. But the impulses that created the Cadaver Synod, the desire to destroy enemies completely, the willingness to violate norms to achieve political goals, the use of religious authority to mask naked power politics. These didn't disappear with church reform. They're with us still, in different forms, in different institutions. We don't put corpses on trial in the 21st century, but we find other ways to desecrate our enemies, to seek revenge beyond all proportion, to use whatever authority we have in service of political or personal grudges. The Cadaver Synod is a warning from history. This is what you become when you let power and revenge overwhelm all other considerations. This is how far you can fall. This is the bottom. Let it remain at the bottom. Let it remain a cautionary tale. Let it remain a story we tell about our worst moments so we can strive to do better. Pope Formosus rests somewhere beneath St. Peter's Basilica, his name on the list of popes, his memory preserved. Pope Stephen VI is forgotten except as the man who committed an atrocity. Both men are at peace now, beyond the reach of earthly politics, beyond revenge, beyond judgment. The corpse has left the throne. The synod has ended. But the story lives on. Thank you for joining me in exploring one of history's strangest and darkest chapters. If you found this journey into the Cadaver Synod fascinating, please like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what other bizarre historical events you'd like me to explore. Because as we've seen today, history is never boring. It's always stranger, darker, and more revealing than we expect. It's always teaching us about ourselves, if we're willing to listen.